Today, I have in the studio with me a creative husband and wife duo, Jonathan and Letishia Kelley. They are filmmakers, music producers, photographers, writers, activists, and Indigenous leaders. And they also have an upcoming exhibition titled Portraits of Change, opening November 5th at PlatteForum, that will be viewable through November 19th. So this exhibition features a provocative photo collection and a short film that documents the Minneapolis uprising and the protests at the 2020 4th of July GOP rallies at Mount Rushmore. So, without further ado, hello
Hello,
to you
hello.
guys.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
I was checking out your bios and your website and stuff, and I noticed that Letishia, you said that you identify as Diné.
Correct.
And it's a word I've never heard or seen before, so I was really curious about it and why that's preferred over Navajo.
Yeah. So Diné
Diné.
is it means the people in Navajo. So as far as like identifying yourself, that's what Navajo people consider themselves is Diné. So that's why I am a Diné woman.
That's awesome.
Yes.
I love that. So let's talk about you guys' upcoming show.
Yeah. So we, as you mentioned, we have our Portraits of Change photo exhibition. That's going to be opening on November 5th at PlatteForum. And it's basically a collection of images that we captured in Minneapolis a few days after George Floyd was murdered, and we all saw that on video. And then we also captured Fourth of July celebration that was taking place in the sacred Black Hills, which is land that belongs essentially to the Lakota tribes. And so we were there documenting the unlawful celebration that was taking place on that day, and really out of a necessity to show things from our perspective, meaning people of color, those of us that aren't always represented in the best way by national media. We really felt like it was a collection of images that we absolutely needed to share with people to be able to understand what was going on from a different point of view.
So how did this project get its start? And like, when did you guys realize, hey, we should do this?
I think we were more, when it first began, I think we were more just working for ourselves and thinking that we had to provide for ourselves, not really understanding like there are outlets and there are places where we're able to show work. And we were approached by a couple of different different places, and just really decided, and speaking with the executive director at the time, PlatteForum, Kim McCarty, we end up started talking about, just what could be. And that's where the conversations actually started, and really looking into what we could bring, not just to PlatteForum, but to everyone.
And I think just even going back a little bit further, I think what really originally prompted us to go to even document the work was I'm from Oakland, California, which historically has been one of maybe few cities that has really been at the forefront of human rights activism and civil rights activism. And I had a brother that was murdered by the police in Oakland when I was about 15. And so, and growing up in California, as a person of color, you often have these experiences with law enforcement and people in authority that aren't necessarily, pleasant experiences for us, and feel a lot like harassments and whatnot. And so when we saw what happened in Minneapolis, we really went originally to be activists first, and we weren't really going to document anything, but it just so happened that when we were there, we saw a lot of the major news outlets photographing and filming, but then when we would go back on the nightly news, we would only see, the buildings on fire, or them talking about all protesters being thugs and looters and arsonists who were burning down the city. And so we felt the need to document what was going on, because we were putting our lives on the line, even just being in both of these places, the Black Hills and then also Minneapolis. So I think once we came back, we really started to think about, the work was bigger than social media. So we kind of started thinking, like, what would that look like? And like Letishia stated, we shared some of the images with a few people, and there were a few different opportunities for us to showcase the works. But I think, Kim and PlatteForum, it just really made sense because of our connection, me being a former board of director, and knowing the type of work that they do. I think that just felt like a natural partnership.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like this work is just embedded in who you both are as people and what you've gone through and experienced in your life. So it just seems like a natural progression
Absolutely.
of your creative process.
Yeah, I think it helped us find that voice,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times as photographers, especially, you're kind of trying to figure out what maybe category or lane you're kind of meant to be in, whether that's, more of a commercial type of photographer or a street photographer. And I think for us, fortunately, we kind of operate in various categories within photography. But I think those experiences that we had in the summer of 2020 definitely shaped, our us as photographers, at least, the way that we saw things.
Definitely. I think also learning experiences as well, like finding out from Minneapolis, the national media on how they cover stories wasn't necessarily the truth in our case, where, like Jonathan said, when we would get back to the hotel room, you would see buildings on fire, but when we were in the protest itself, it was peaceful. You saw unity, you saw all colors coming together, and some of that is what we captured, and the trauma and all of that is what we captured. But from the national media standpoint, for us, as people of color, you tend to look to the media for your daily news, right? And you're thinking, okay, yeah, this is what they're showing, this is what we're seeing, this is how we should interpret it. But on the outside, it's different. And I think that was one of the biggest learning experiences of 2020, of the pandemic, that maybe the national media isn't necessarily covering what we're thinking that they're covering. So for us to capture something in a different way in our perspective on what we've experienced during these protests, it's a whole lot different than what the national media has portrayed. And that's where we did find the voice to say, hey, you know what? We got to tell these stories. We have to tell these individual stories who nobody knows about, right? Like from even with the indigenous people, for, what happened to my reservation during the COVID. We lost a lot of elders during that time. And yes, it made the national media, but you don't really understand like their perspective as far as like, what does losing an elder mean? That's language, that's culture, that's tradition, that's people that are, on the top of the totem pole where they're teaching, for the 7 generations coming up, right? So, and just really being aware of like, hey, the national media may not be telling the full truth. So I think that was a good learning lesson to actually see it from that opposite end as well. And to share that side, like, hey, maybe the national media isn't your number one correspondence that you should, be thinking about taking that advice or taking that, perspective.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the questions I was going to ask, was how was this event portrayed differently based on your experience within the media? And it's true. I mean, I wasn't there, but on the news, I saw every time I looked at the news and heard about what was going on, it was all insanity. You were seeing the protesters and the looters lighting things on fire. You were seeing violence, and you were thinking, "Oh my God, that's all that you see. That's all that you think is happening." And so I'm sure that a very skewed picture was painted for the public, and in a way, it's really sad because it puts the people fighting for justice in this, paints this picture of them as just so violent and so dangerous and out of control, and it really goes against everything that like these people are fighting for and standing up for. So it's
And I think that's kind of why the Portraits of Change exhibition is so important, because it takes away that whitewashing of the narrative, right? And again, what Letishia mentioned, when we were there, some of the images we captured, we were around 10,000 people, in one space of all colors, ages, races, genders. I mean, all types of people in one particular area. Not to mention, this is at the height of the COVID pandemic, right? This is in May of 2020. So we're trying to navigate that aspect of everything as well. And you had majority, I'd probably say probably between 90 to 95% of people there who had masks, who were walking around with hand sanitizer, who were making sure everyone was together and taken care of. And you had places like outlets like CNN and NBC and all of these major news outlets that were literally pushing people of color who were documenting, what was going on out of the way so that they could have these cameras here capturing these moments. But yet on the news, none of that was being shown, right? It wasn't being shown that a lot of the burning of the property and buildings that was going on wasn't actually started by protesters. It was actually started by other people that had alternative motives, who were not even a part of those particular protests. And naturally, when you get people that are angry, all it takes is one little thing to happen, right? A building starts catching on fire and you have people with all of these emotions going on. Naturally, people are going to join in on that. But to make it seem like everyone was just out there for that purpose, to destroy property or, to tear down a city, was, I feel like that was wrong. And for people to miss the whole point of why people were even out there to begin with, and to talk about the property being burning in the city, I felt like that was missing over the whole point of why people were even protesting to begin with. So I think what we were able to capture out of that really was something that shows a totally different narrative, and hopefully something that inspires a more humanistic sort of a outlook on situations that happen that maybe we don't know anything about, or we're not a part of those, but maybe we can start to look at people in these situations from a more human perspective versus just, how could you do this to your city sort of situation.
Yeah, and I think too, you say that humanistic element of what happened. I think all the people coming together, the different colors, the different types of people, it really says a lot, not just that protest about Black Lives Matter, but human rights, right? I mean, you had all kinds of people out there protesting for Black Lives Matter. That gives you a glimpse of like, hey, you know what? Something's not right here. They're being mistreated, and yet the people that are not protesting for Black Lives Matter, it's just, there's a big gap in the sense where like other people are feeling Black Lives Matter, right? It is humans matter, right? Like we deserve to all be treated a certain way, right? We all deserve to be treated with respect, and I think that that also took it to another level. Like, it's one thing when a group just protests for a group, but when you have everybody protesting for that injustice, it's a whole lot more intense as to just one group protesting for a certain something. So I think that was a good experience too. It was actually beautiful in the chaos of everything. You actually saw human beings coming together, sticking together, loving one another, being kind to each other, having respect for each other. And it was amazing to be involved in that, to be around those people in the couple of protests in Minneapolis, and then having to go to the Black Hills and then looking at it through the indigenous perspective as well. Everything was togetherness. Everything was, hey, we're going to come together and we're going to stick up for what we feel like the people need to be treated like, right? So,
Can you guys share about maybe what was one of the most impactful moments for you during either of these protests, or like while you were out there with your cameras?
Um, for me, ironically, the most, or maybe not ironically, but the most impactful moment for me was actually with the Lakota in the Black Hills, because again, growing up in a place where protests were pretty common, and fighting for civil rights and human rights was pretty common, I was very used to what happened in Minneapolis. That wasn't really new to me. But the strategy that I saw employed by the Lakota in the Black Hills completely blew me away. And I think it really helped me understand how all of our different struggles and protests and fights, if we could be connected, how valuable and how powerful it could really be. And I think that's also why there's so much division kind of created, because I think people understand that if all of these different voices connect and really start pushing for a more collective agenda, we could really see some dynamic changes. But in the Black Hills, there was maybe 200 Lakota. It was mainly led by the youth. So the youth organized the protests, and they were at the forefront of the protests.
and they were women,
They were
young
there. They
young
were
women.
young women, and so that right there off the bat was something completely different. And the fact that they were leading this, and then the men that were there were more in a supportive role and a protective role, making sure that everyone was okay. Um, but I saw those 200 Lakota. I saw a strategy. They took they had vans, and so at one point they lined the vans up and literally took the wheels off the van, and that prevented people from driving up to the celebration. Right.
Whoa.
So that in itself was like, that's
Resourcefulness
strategically
Yes.
and
resourceful,
strategic, yeah.
right? How do you keep people from going? You block the road and you take the tires off the van. So that in itself, I was like, that's pretty resourceful. And then they were not being aggressive. They weren't like, you know, doing anything necessarily to the police or to the National Guard to provoke anything, but they were holding their grounds. And once the National Guard and the police started to employ tactics with rubber bullets and tear gas and whatnot, they actually had, tear gas masks, they had shields, they were very prepared and very strategically like aware of what was going on. And I saw those 200 Lakota hold off the National Guard and the police for almost 6 hours. Not only that, I then saw the leaders of those movements go to the police and actually negotiate for elders, children, anyone that did not want to be arrested to be able to leave with no repercussions. So I felt like
Wow.
there was an awareness within that to say, hey, there's some of us that are willing to take this all the way, but for those that are not, don't feel bad about it. Don't feel like you didn't show up today. Leave. You're free to go, essentially. So all of that combined, I just felt like it was something I had never seen before. I've been in situations where the the protesting numbers have far outweighed the police, and the police are definitely seeming like having the upper hand on the people. So to see that situation and to see the conviction, there were people literally ready to die that day over their lands and over their rights. And I think that forever changed me in terms of like what it meant to really put it on the line. So that for me is probably that moment.
Wow.
Yeah, for me, I think it is near the precinct in Minneapolis. So we were looking from afar. Beginning of the protest, they had some Aztec dancers kind of doing like a blessing with the people, and we were kind of standoffish, kind of far from the back, kind of elevated so we could look down. And then I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden the whole crowd just turned in our direction, and there was kind of like a platform right behind us, and the speakers and the whole mics just came and just within like 30 to 45 seconds just moved exactly where we were standing. So now we have the speakers here, we have the microphones here, we have people ready to, talk about their experience. And one of the women there, we named her Mama Justice. And we named her that because she was a Sudanese woman. And she was telling the story of how she was watching this on TV, and she was a little north of Minneapolis where she lived. But she had said, when George Floyd was crying mama, she's like, I felt like he was calling me. You know what I mean? Like she felt that to her core, and her whole emotion of talking and, having the courage to, to express her sadness, her trauma, her everything that was in her as a woman. And she's not necessarily an American woman. She's from Sudan, but she's still feeling, all these different emotions that were happening that day. And it was really emotional. And I said, you know what? We have to do this. We can't, because first of all, I'm claustrophobic. Like, and when 10,000 people come and turn your way and you're right in the middle of it, and you have, CNN, NBC cameras just right here, and everybody is having their cameras, everybody's trying to see, everybody's trying to do this. I kind of felt stuck. And Jonathan asked me like, hey, do you want to leave? I know this is too close for you. And again, it's in the midst of the pandemic, right? We're very close to each other. And I was like, no, we have to do this. We have to hear these stories. We have to document them. We took film as well. We took video of it, and we captured these photos of it too. So that was very impactful for me, because at that point it became real, right? It became real. And I was there to support Jonathan from the beginning when he was like, hey, we're 3 hours from Minneapolis. Like, I feel compelled to do this. Will you join me? And I have no hesitation, but yes, we have to go, we have to see. But at that moment for me, it was it became real. And to see the Sudanese mother just talk about that, it was like, people need to hear this. People need to understand what it's really like, to understand like the trauma that a lot of the people of color go through on a daily basis, not just something tragically, but just dealing with, the U.S. government system or the U.S. school systems or any type of systematic thing that we have here in America. We have to start talking about those things. And as well as the indigenous people, there's a long history that we need to talk about, and we need to start that healing.
Wow, you guys, those are two really beautiful stories, and I feel really moved by them. And I totally agree that we do need to have these conversations. So thank you for sharing your experiences,
Thank you.
with this exhibition. And And I know you're also doing conversations with Gen Z as well.
Yes.
So you'll be talking to the youth, which is a really important thing. Speaking of having conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys are going to be talking a bit about maybe police brutality and how it's tied to colonization.
Yeah, I think there's a few different topics. I know that is one of them. I think for us, the conversations with Gen Z, honestly, like I mean, I'm excited obviously for the exhibition. It's our first exhibition, but I'm really excited about the conversations with Gen Z. We did a kind of a short walkthrough of what our exhibition was about and showing some of the art lab interns, you know, the photographs and some of the video, which we hadn't looked at the video since we came back from Minneapolis last year. So it was like our first time seeing it, and we were sharing it, you know, with them, and it kind of took us right back to that moment and all of those emotions. But a lot of the questions that they asked us were some very hard, you know, questions that we hadn't really talked about, and it really made us realize how traumatic that experience was and still is to this day. So I'm really looking forward to the insight of the young people. I think, again, that's something that I really took away from, even in Minneapolis. There was a lot of young people that were leading, you know, these protests and these uprisings, and I think there's much to gain from our young people. I think giving them the space and for them to feel safe and asking those questions and taking those actions collectively, I think we can learn a lot from them and not just dismissing them as just young people. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation personally.
Oh, yeah, indeed. And I think also, too, just to piggyback off of what you just said, like the younger generation is, you know, far brighter than we were at that age with all this technology and everything. And it's a good time to start having those conversations with them, to teach them how to think versus what to think, right? Anytime that we're in, you know, systematic, you know, institutions, we are always taught what to think. You know, you gotta, you know, do this in school. You got to do this in college. You got to do this at the job. You got to do this in corporate America, right? We're always taught to do, this is what you have to do. We're never really taught of how. Right? How do we do this? How can I think about this? How should I think about this? Right? So giving them that safe space, like you said, Jonathan, like we need to let them speak what is on their mind. That does a lot for a child or for a teenager, especially, you know, when we think about our teenage years and when we were young adults, like, you know, we wish somebody was there to help guide us in that way, or even just to feel that safe space, like, hey, I can talk about this. And we have a few people in our family. We have a daughter who's 19. We have, I have my closest nieces and nephew who are 20, 18, and 16. Yep. So we have a lot of this conversation in the household already about, you know, teaching them how to think versus what to think. And we always reiterate to them, like, you know, this is a safe place you can come to if you need to talk. And I think those conversations with Gen Z is that very place where we're able to assist them as well.
Absolutely.
That's like such a radical thing to do that historically just hasn't been available in general to young people, you know, and I think it's something that can help us evolve and change and grow as humans. And it's so sad that we haven't valued that in our society enough, that it becomes a radical act to say this is a safe space for us to talk about these uncomfortable things happening in the world and address our differences and address the injustices that are happening. It's also, this is maybe off topic, but it is Halloween. And I was also thinking about, you know, ancestor work and how when you're rooted to your ancestors and you're having conversations with them at the altar, you're supposed to bring up the stuff that you're working through that has been passed down to you through generations in order to heal that in yourself. So it makes sense to, you know, do that as a collective as well.
Absolutely. and, and
Indeed.
and I think that's a big part too for us is understanding, that we carry our own traumatic experiences up until this point, too. And this exhibition is meant to bring up those uncomfortable topics. It's meant to inspire that conversation. It's meant to begin that process of kind of like collectively moving forward and hopefully a healing process that can happen. But I do think that that is also a large part of this work as well, is addressing those things that have just continued to go on from generation and generation, and you just kind of keep pushing it further and further down, and just kind of moving on without actually saying, hey, this actually did affect me. Like I said, watching those videos again really brought back that traumatic experience. I'm not over that experience. The pandemic, I don't know if I'll ever be right from what we've gone through in 2020. Like, I still have kind of like PTSD. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but I still feel that traumatic experience anytime I kind of look at those images or see the video of what we went through. And so I think the only way to be able to do that is to have these types of conversations where we can just be honest about how we feel about things and how it makes us feel, and then also not taking it personally. Think there's a lot of that happening right now, whether it's politics or beliefs or things where people are taking things personally and not really being able to just address the issues. So I hope that's something that can come of this exhibition as well.
Yeah, and really just awareness is a big key in that. It's the first step to acknowledge that there is injustice, there is, trauma, there has been pain, there's been a lot of things that weren't necessarily on the table and now they're on the table, and there's certain things that have to be addressed in that, and one of that is white supremacy and the other one is privilege, because we've learned that it's not really necessarily just white supremacy. It's also certain, individuals having a certain type of privilege, right? And to understand that, like, we have to equal out that if we all want to eat at the table. If we're putting stuff on the table and we all want to eat at the table, let's start that conversation, right? Let's begin talking about that. And I think that is definitely the first step.
How do you think people can what do you think people can do to evoke change in their communities for the better in regards to these issues?
That's an easy question. You got to change yourself. That's the number one thing in my personal journey as far as like healing and learning about myself and understanding myself and centering myself back, is you got to change yourself. You got to change that thinking in yourself. And one of those things is to just treat someone the way that you want to be treated. Simple as that.
And I think honestly, having discussions, and particularly in your community and with people that don't think like you necessarily, right? I think sometimes we can get really comfortable with just being in these groups where we all think the same and, we want the same things, but that doesn't really cause you to grow. Sometimes you need to have those challenging moments with someone that doesn't necessarily think like you or agree with the same things that you do, and you can pull the best out of each other, and take those parts and build on that, and be okay with the fact that we don't always have to agree. We don't always have to have the same thoughts and opinions, but as a community, collectively, how do we coexist, and understanding that what is an issue for you is also an issue for me, whether it directly impacts me or not. just understanding that, we're a community, so what happens to one is essentially happening to all. I think that's really the best way that you can get, obviously what Letishia said is kind of step one, but I think that's the way that you can collectively affect change in your community itself.
Awesome. I had a question in the back of my head and I just forgot what it was. But that makes me think about what you were saying about the way that the Lakota were handling themselves at the protest, because they were doing it in a way that it was peaceful and did involve communication with the opposing forces that were against them, and they were doing it in such a graceful way. And I feel like that's something that we need to learn to do as a whole, just everybody on the planet. Otherwise, we're all going to die.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the way things are going. Not to be like, it's so...
bearer of bad news. It's facts, though.
Yeah, it is true.
And I think that was, I think there's a lot to gain from indigenous wisdom as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really grateful for Letishia. We were friends for a lot longer than what we've actually been together as partners, but our friendship was really based on a lot of this type of information. I was really curious about just her upbringing, and the way that she saw things was totally different than what I was used to. And a lot of it is that indigenous wisdom that has been passed down to her through various generations in her family, and the way that she's able to see the duality in the opposing sides. So again, I think there's much to be learned. You see a lot of what's happening right now with the land back movement and environmental climate change movements that are being led by indigenous communities all over the world. And there's so much knowledge, I think, that could be shared and collectively help us to move forward. But like you mentioned, Esther, it's gonna depend on us to take those steps, right? Or else we kind of know where we're headed, right? So I think there's so much wisdom that's out there. It's just a matter of, can we get out of our own way? Can we get out of our own opinions? And we all in some sort of way have benefited from privilege, and we've all, some of us more so than others, have been hurt by that lack of privilege. So I think the number one thing is being able to acknowledge these things. I feel like that's really what's got us in this weird space. Is, no one's really willing to just stand up and say, hey, you know what, this was wrong, and the way we've handled this is wrong. How do we move forward? It's always an explanation of why something is the way that it is, and never just an admission and just, okay, now how do we correct this?
Yeah, I think accountability is one of the biggest things that, people of color are looking for. It is a first step. And even with the land back movement with the indigenous, the appreciation is there for a land acknowledgement, but it takes it further to rebuild something, to actually have an action behind it. And that's where the point is now. And that's what the pandemic and the whole, 2020 has taught us. Like, we gotta push it forward. For a long time, there are a lot of us that were distracted. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of us that are still distracted. There are a lot of us who still want to go back to the norm, but there are some of us who have been changed by it, that are no longer stagnant, that have, been woken up from the distractions that go on with entertainment and America and news and all these different things. But at the same time, there's some of us who do want to push it forward. And a lot of that does begin with the younger generation, right? They are smarter. They know how to get on social media, and they can gather up 30 people if they need to. And that was one thing about the Lakota young women that got them together. They did all of this on social media. We heard through Facebook and Instagram. A lot. It wasn't on the major news, it wasn't on South Dakota news saying that, hey, there's going to be a protest here. There wasn't an organization behind it, but it's really just embracing those type of things and supporting the younger generation so we can prepare them for our way out, right? So definitely.
So could I ask you guys what you guys are up to after this exhibition, and if you have any future projects on the horizon?
I think that's a loaded question.
Yeah. What month shall we begin?
Right. So we do have, as Letishia mentioned, we do have video footage that's also a film that we're working on called Portraits of Change. And that has kind of been expanded, so that'll probably be coming out early 2023. And then we are collaborating with a good friend of ours, a fellow photographer from Denver named Drew Smith. We started a project called Point and Shoot, and it is highlighting emerging photographers that documented 2020 in various places like Minneapolis and Louisville, Denver, and then also the Bay Area. So we actually just got approved for a grant to do a photo book. So we
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to be featuring those certain photographers and kind of giving that platform to showcase, what 2020 meant to them. And then we also have a documentary that's going to be going along with that as well, titled Point and Shoot, that will start shooting, filming, in early 2022, so around March, April. Social media platform, online platform.
That's awesome.
Kelley's,
Thank you for the work that you guys are doing.
Two creatives,
Thank you for
which is
so
two
where
lowercase i's
online
and then the word creatives. So it'll be twocreatives.com, and then you can also find us on Instagram at twocreatives_.
Yes, and we have our exhibition this Friday, November 5th.
Can't forget that.
Yes, and our exhibition will be up until the 19th, so you can see the work live in action there.
Yeah, and that's that platform's new home at the Savoy Curtis Park on 27th in Arapahoe in Denver.
They will also be at an event called Convos with Gen Z, Saturday, November 6th at 1 p.m. at the Savoy at Curtis Park, where I just learned that Denver Police Chief Paul Pazin will be there, who I guess has focused heavily on community policing, crime prevention, and de-escalation training, which is interesting. And the interns will be discussing the topics of the work you guys do with other leaders of the community as well. If you would like to donate to PlatteForum, visit our website at PlatteForum.org. And I also just want to thank the donors and supporters over the years who have chosen to support our crossover of art and social justice. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.